Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session, A Future Where Alternative Proteins Are No Longer Alternative. My name is Amelia Lucas, and I've been covering this space as a food and beverage reporter for CNBC.com. Okay, and joining us on the panel today are Jordan Bar-Am from McKinsey, Elizabeth Gutschenritter from Cargill, Eugene Klerk from Credit Suisse, and Celeste Holz-Schietinger from Impossible Foods. Okay, and now that all of our panelists are here, I'd like to start off by asking everyone what they think the alternative protein market will look like in 2030, or what about even 2040 or 2050? So let's start off with Jordan and what your expectations are.
I'd say I think it's a much more diverse landscape than what we see today. I think, when we look out today, we see that there's several pioneers, but it's still a lot of folks doing kind of working with off-the-shelf parts and pieces. It's still, protein is still a relatively insulated industry in terms of who's seeking to participate. You see a much more kind of broad, diverse group seeking to meet consumer demands in other parts of food and beverage. And I think we'll see a lot more folks piling in as they kind of the basis of competition changes from a disassembly industry, which is what protein is today, largely to one of kind of assembly and formulation that we see it moving to going forward.
Okay, great. And Elizabeth, what does your vision look like?
Yeah, similar to Jordan, I think certainly one of more choice. I think consumers will have quite a bit more choices, whether they be alternative protein or beef, poultry, or peanut butter. I think consumers will move freely between additional choices in this amount of time in the future.
Eugene, anything to add there? Anything different in your vision for the future?
Well, good morning, everyone, first and foremost. Yeah, I think that probably two things worth highlighting is a lot of surveys continuously highlight that younger consumers in particular, we're talking Generation Z, but also the millennials, are really open to trying alternative protein. I mean, 2/3 of consumers in Asia belong to Generation Z and millennials. So I think that will drive the market. And I think from a supply perspective, one thing which will be really interesting to see is the sort of increasing activity of the larger food and meat companies and their involvement. We've seen quite a bit of activity of these larger companies buying into the alternative market, and with their balance sheets and marketing budgets, they will be key drivers, I think, for not just increasing supply, but also increasing awareness and potentially acceptance of those products. So I think the growth outlook is absolutely phenomenal for the alternative space.
Okay, thank you. And Celeste, what do you think? Oh, Celeste, you're still muted. If you could unmute.
What we really need is solutions at large volumes. So by that time, we need large quantities of what hopefully is not alternative anymore. And thinking about crops grown for the purpose of quality. Is that particular textures, flavors, nutrition, and not more of a kind of crop that we get to take off of from other sources, and really focus on growing the beans or the seeds or the fermentation based on the need of the consumer. And the volumes need to be huge to be able to replace animal agriculture. So it's really quality, scale. The scale will bring down the cost and really will enable the elimination of animal agriculture by having these proteins at quality and volumes.
Okay, great. And Eugene, in your deep dive on alternative proteins, you say a change toward a plant-based diet appears inevitable if the global food system is to become more sustainable. Tell me why you're so certain about that.
Yeah, I mean, what we did in our analysis is we looked at a range of areas impacted by the food system. Obviously today, a lot of focus is on the environmental side, and we know that 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions, give or take, can be attributed to the entire food system from farm to fork. So there's plenty of reason from an environmental perspective why a much greater focus probably than is being applied today on the food system is necessary. you could almost go as far as saying that COP26 will be a disaster if food actually isn't a central part of it. But we also looked at the health implications. And just to put this into context, if you think about undernourishment and overweight and obesity, about 700 million people today are globally undernourished, a number that perversely has started to increase ever since the SDGs were launched in 2015. And we have about 1.8 billion or so adults globally that are either overweight or obese. And what that means is that in our calculations, the cost to the global economy is about $13 trillion. So about 15% of global GDP is either at risk or is already being impacted. So you have these two massive drivers that, in our view, make it essential for the three stakeholders, corporates, governments, and consumers, to think about food. Maybe one thing to add finally is that when thinking about climate change, it isn't just about switching from an animal-based product, which is highly environmentally intense, whether it's emissions or water use or land use, to a plant-based version, but it is also very much thinking about reforestation. I think one of the sometimes under-focused areas that is a secondary benefit of a change in dietary sort of consumption patterns is the ability to use land that will become available for reforestation. When done properly, that is a significant driver to help achieve long-term climate change targets. So there are various ways, various reasons why we think it is an absolutely crucial area to focus on.
Okay, and speaking of the shift toward plant-based proteins and alternative proteins, Elizabeth, Cargill CEO, recently stated that plant-based protein will be 10% of the market over the next couple of years. When do you expect that to happen, and what are your longer-term growth projections for that market?
Yeah, certainly we do expect significant growth. Our projections are that protein demand will double in the next 30 years. So Cargill takes a very inclusive view of solving for this increased demand. We see alternative protein and animal protein and cultured protein across a spectrum of necessary protein choices to solve for this gap. So we know these markets will be meaningful, but the number, I think, and what the size of these markets are and the opportunity and the timing will very much depend on our ability to meet consumer needs. So we think about improvements, and we're really focusing our activity around improvements across protein. So improving the sustainability of our animal protein business, while additionally accelerating and scaling our alternative protein activities. So I think certainly we all expect demand to grow, and our ability to meet consumer needs being a critical factor in kind of the timing and sizing of this market.
Okay, and along those lines, within the alternative protein market, how big are each of these different segments going to be? Plant-based protein versus cultivated meat versus fermented proteins. So I'm interested to hear, Celeste, what you have to say on this.
I think starting from thinking about where is the large quantity of protein that's in plants. And plants are going to bring the most sustainable source of protein just from an energy conversion standpoint. So when you think of the proteins used for the kind of bulk aspect of products, the textural components, the main driver of those nutritions is going to be coming from your plant proteins. That doesn't mean other sources, fermentation is going to be a key driver for more of your kind of specialty ingredients. So at Impossible Foods, we ferment our heme to drive the flavor chemistry. So that's really critical, and there'll be identification of much more important proteins to modify texture and flavor. But really, this key source will come from plants.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have any different opinions? Anything on cultivated meat? I know, Jordan, you've done some research into that area.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I think we'd expect to see some of the barriers between these categories breaking down as kind of more hybrids make their way into it. And based on our research, we do see consumers willing to to blend things, right? Like it's not crazy that there are people eating Impossible burgers with bacon on top when they get it at Burger King, right? Because frankly, the consumer the consumer wants what they want, and it's really the flexitarian that we think is the main driver of this. We do see some incredibly some meaningful progress needs to be made for cultivated to kind of begin to scale it and meet consumer needs, particularly around price, and kind of think of those across 3 dimensions. The chemicals, so the growth media needs to be significantly reduced, something around 750x where it is today. The infrastructure is just the bioreactor capacity would need to basically grow 100-fold, just to hit about 1% of meat demand, and then biologically with performance of cells and cell lines to be able to make it cheap. And I think it's really important as we look at this to say, at the end of the day, this product has to be really delicious and it has to be really cheap and affordable to compete with what it has to, what it's trying to displace to achieve the transition. And those are pretty ironclad rules if we just look historically at what's driven diets and consumption, and that's kind of the bar. And I think would agree with Celeste that plant-based today I think is the most competitive in offering delicious and affordable protein, and clearly a lot of those players are working hard to continue driving the cost down to meet that demand.
Yeah, and this idea of hybridization that you're talking about, Jordan, that kind of falls with what Elizabeth was saying before about the animal meat market and making that more sustainable and versus an alternative protein market, and how do those mesh together? Are they always going to be competing, or is there a way to make it work together in some way? Elizabeth, did you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll go back to the consumer need and choice here. I think that we, as an industry, alternative protein versus animal protein has been just that, like this versus conversation. And from what we see, and Jordan mentioned flexitarians, I think as we approach the protein business and as Cargill looks at what needs protein will have in the future, for us, it's not as polarizing as maybe it is made out to be. And it's not as polarizing for consumers either. Our consumers easily move and intend to, as I mentioned, I expect that to continue into the future, but today they easily move between protein choices. And, as we look at these statistics, that 98% of consumers that consume alternative protein today also purchase conventional and consume conventional meats. And for me, that is both I think a challenge for our alternative protein business to continue to improve the eating performance and experience that consumers have with these products, but additionally recognition that consumers are looking for protein, and depending on who they're feeding and what meal occasion it is and a variety of factors, they will be able to choose from a variety of options well into the future. And so, yeah, I think that would be maybe where I would continue to message is just this optionality. Hybrids, Jordan mentioned hybrids as well. I think that that's another viable option. And so as an industry, I think the more we can talk about these solutions, improving the whole of protein offerings, and what that we need to do in order to do those, in order to meet consumer and customer needs into the future.
Yeah, and Celeste, obviously Impossible Foods has a very different mission than Cargill. Impossible's mission is to replace animal meat entirely. So what do you think we have to do to reach that goal? And when do you think we can reach that goal, if that's possible?
Correct. Our planet needs a solution. We're kind of in the dire strait of climate change. Our land is being used mostly to feed us through animals, and there are solutions. And having a plant-based diet, making plant-based meats, dairies, seafood is critical to do that. So at Impossible Food, our mission is to replace animal agriculture by 2035. Yes, that is ambitious, but our global health needs it. From us as humans to all the rest of the planet biodiversity, we need solutions. To get there, we need everybody on each level to be working together. So that could be small startups starting up to try to innovate and solve something. That could be the growing up startups like Impossible. But we need really the Cargills and the big companies that have history and knowledge and technology base to really drive scale as well. And I think there is a hopefully government part to this as well, because this is helpful to the whole planet's health, the health of the people. And so we really need everyone to get together to be able to make this happen. And I think many have mentioned here, it starts with the decision of the consumer. And consumers will continue to care more as they learn more about the issues of eating animals. However, that's not going to be the driver for change. The driver of change is the quality, the cost, the availability of the products. So how do we keep innovating so that we understand how to make meat more delicious than comes from the animal? And that's my specialty, really, is to try to understand that. And it's really exciting that we are figuring out how to make things even more delicious than comes from the animal, because we have much more tools and abilities and we can evolve much faster. And that's the same thing that we really need to do at the protein level so that the products can perform great.
Okay, great. So Celeste, you've kind of given us a few things that you feel like we need to move toward in order to achieve this vision. What does everybody else think in terms of, reaching this far-fetched, it seems, idea of alternative protein no longer being alternative? What are the big steps that need to be taken? What do consumers need to do? What do manufacturers need to do? Eugene, if you want to start off.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, firstly, maybe pushing back a little on the plant-based story is that if you look at the academic research, we don't have to go to a world where we don't eat a single animal. This is not sort of related to animal welfare, but from an environmental perspective, even if you take 10 billion people, and even if you take further expansion of the middle class across emerging countries and what that is likely to do to average diets, it is not true that we need to eradicate animal protein consumption. And in fact, there's a lot of academic research that suggests that from an environmental perspective, having some animal sort of agricultural left actually is environmentally desirable. So maybe that is good to keep in mind. Now, in terms of how do we get to a world that is a lot more sustainable, because the current system is not sustainable, and it certainly is not going to be sustainable if we don't improve with 10 billion people and the expansion of a middle class. There are three actors in this play: consumers, regulators, governments, and corporates. On the consumer side, that's only good news, because we know that younger consumers are very engaged with the topic, and anyone that has a household with younger consumers in it knows that you don't want to have 3 different types of milk in your fridge, and you end up probably at the end of the day having a plant-based version of milk, just to keep the peace, I guess, in your household. So that is a driver for change going forward. So that's a tick in the box. On the corporate side, we know that the level of investment into alternative product, be it plant-based, be it cultivated, be it fermentation-based, for example, is rapidly increasing and will continue to increase. And we'll probably talk about ESG a little bit later on as an additional driver for that. So that's also good news. Capital needs to increase a lot more, but at least the trajectory is good. The third actor, on the other hand, is the one that I am very skeptical of, because I think that maybe for obvious reasons, politicians so far refuse to really engage with this topic. And maybe that's for the simple reason that if you tell people to change what they eat, you're probably not going to win a lot of votes. And so that is the one area where I think we probably need to rely least on. So at the end of the day, it is the corporate sector, in my view, that will need to invest and will need to develop technologies, will reduce cost for alternative products, will make it more tasteful. We've talked about this before, that in the end then will meet consumer demand and consumer requirements. And if those two actors join up, then I have no doubt that we will get to a place probably close to what Celeste is talking about. I'm not completely convinced that you'll be able to get the world off meat completely, but that's perhaps a different topic.
Amelia, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. On the topic of regulation, there's obviously, sometimes we need these regulators to approve certain products, like for Impossible Foods, the use of heme before it could be sold in grocery stores in the US, and on the cultivated meat front, and approving that for sale in restaurants and in grocery stores too. So I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts on, how do you get regulators to, join the side of alternative protein? How big of a hurdle really is it going through that process?
I can comment. So I think there's a few parts of regulation. One, you could say we have ways to make sure our consumers are safe and processes for that. That's really critical. And it's required on all protein side and kind of make sure that our consumers are safe and our processes there. So even if sometimes things are slowed down, we should make sure that that's the case. However, we want to make sure the decisions are not based off of politics or anything like that, but the decisions are based on science and the data collected. So I think that's really critical. Other things in terms of how things are labeled or where things can go, that can also play a role. And again, how do we lead with what's good for the consumer? And really what's good for the consumer is leading with science, the data, and transparency of communication.
Okay, great. Thank you, Celeste. Jordan, do you have anything to say on the front for cultivated meat? Because that's a big area right now.
I just say, I think, I share, I think, with Eugene, the idea that would be pretty skeptical of governments playing a super directive role in telling people what they, can and can't eat. That said, I think, we are seeing, I think, cultivated and alternative protein more generally kind of making its way onto the agendas in terms of food sovereignty and food security. I think, COVID was a pretty traumatic experience in seeing, supply chains that have been optimized around efficiency and leanness being disrupted, in ways that I think, surprised a lot of folks. And I think as people turn their attention more towards resiliency, we're seeing governments say, hey, come develop these technologies here. We're excited to not be as dependent on imports, and as climate change begins to, have an even greater impact on the reliability of certain supply chains, this I think is a very valuable hedge. So less around kind of being directive and telling people, but potentially more around this fitting into the kind of food security agenda of various regions, particularly Middle East, Southeast Asia, et cetera.
Thanks for that, Jordan. On a slightly different topic, Elizabeth, Cargill CEO, has mentioned that plant-based proteins will begin to cannibalize your beef business. So I'm curious how that affects your strategy and how you think about that, from a competition standpoint.
Yes, certainly. I mean, Cargill, from a strategy standpoint, intends to be the leading provider of protein. So like I mentioned, we view this across the spectrum. Our strategy is to lead in proteins, whether they be animal-based or plant-based or cultivated. I think consumers will choose where that mix lies in the future. And our ability as an industry, as an alternative protein category, to, I think, close some of these gaps that have been mentioned here today in eating experience. I think several have mentioned how important taste is and the eating experience of whether it be plant-based or cultivated. And so I think, being able to determine where these categories will be in the future is largely based on the work that we're doing now. So I really appreciate these discussions and the panels and the investment and work that's being put into this category, because I think it's what will lead to the eventual success of these. At the core of Cargill's protein business, we believe these are complementary. We believe that there is certainly a lot of synergy that happens between our animal protein businesses and our alternative protein businesses. Our customers see these as very synergistic as well, as we service customers with their needs across the spectrum. And it really allows Cargill to bring a 155-year history to bear. We have a lot of resources across our ingredients and food science businesses, culinary expertise, and certainly quite a large network of manufacturing. And so for us, the strategy is closing a gap, like I mentioned. Protein, there is certainly with population growth, we see a big gap coming, and our mission is to nourish the world in a safe and responsible and sustainable way. And so we know that we'll have to do that across all protein offerings that we have that are available to us.
Okay, and on the topic of strategy, I'm curious, Celeste, as someone who works for a manufacturer of these plant-based meats, how do you balance creating new alternatives and expanding production and distribution of your existing substitutes, like the Impossible Burger or Impossible Sausage?
To make a difference, we really do need to do both. We need to expand our reach, so really focus on how do we increase manufacturing at both the protein level. So how do we produce more and more heme? How do we have more of the proteins needed with low off flavors, the right textural properties, and then even manufacturing of our actual product. So our strategy is really, if we can, our focus really is how do we innovate and make those things as efficient as possible, partner with companies that can make us kind of faster, leverage, and continue to expand. So we don't think of ourselves as having to do it all. We want partners at every step of the way and really leverage what our expertise is. And that's really our way of thinking about it. So you could say on the manufacturing side, we partner with OSI to do a lot of our production. Same with thinking about the proteins, is how do we partner with companies that have a large base and knowledge to scale. And our company really started on kind of the innovation platform. How do we just make key discoveries that are missing so that we can make the breakthroughs and provide the consumers what they need? So that is really key to us. And that's really, you'd say we put a huge focus on that. How do we understand what drives deliciousness and the flavor for each of the meats, dairies, seafoods? What are the proteins that drive each of the functionality that is needed? And then thinking through, if you find a protein of interest, what are each of the steps along the entire path? Do we need new seeds? Do we need new processes of extraction of that protein? How does it interact and mix with other ingredients to be able to make the final product? So kind of for us, it is, we need to do both things and do it very strongly. And how do we leverage the outside as much as possible for scale?
And thinking of those breakthroughs, what are some innovations on the horizons that need to happen in order to expand the share of the market and successfully grab some of that animal protein market share?
So talking about innovation, I'll start with even some of the most recent innovations we've done, and to me is kind of a tipping point to being able to meet the consumer needs, is our latest launches have been in this kind of chicken and pig space. And what we've been able to find is by understanding the right combination of plant proteins with the fats and the right combination with understanding at the molecular level the flavor that drives these animal characteristics and what is delicious, we can outperform the animal on all metrics. The deliciousness can outperform in consumer tests. It's more nutritious on protein, fats, no cholesterol, and of course, it's much more sustainable. So really being able to look at what the consumer needs and look at those markets. You could say the one where we still need to make leverage, which I think is part of scale, is still on the cost front. So that is an innovation area, which I say scale helps and will just kind of allow for that. But to do things more efficiency requires innovation. So you could say on our side, innovations related to how do we create heme the most efficient way as possible. So it's a fermentation-based process to make our heme that drives our flavor. And so can we make that more efficient? What are the processes to do that? There's breakthroughs on that front. And then there's, of course, breakthroughs on what are the ingredients that drive different functionalities that are needed. And as we diversify from ground meat platforms to whole cuts, dairy, seafood, we really need proteins that bring different functionality. Right now, the proteins that are at scale to create consumer products are very few. the toolbox that nature has given us on proteins and different functionalities is giant. Even if you go and take soy, we think of soy as just soy. There's actually hundreds of different proteins with different functionalities within soy. And you could separate those out and start to get functions that drive the characteristics that consumers like on the sensory side, and bring what is needed there. And of course, when you bring in different plants, different sources, that's either from leaves or seeds, you start to diversify that platform even more.
Okay, great. So in your view, cost and new ingredients are the two things that would really be big catalysts for Impossible Foods. I'm curious what everybody else thinks would be catalysts that would significantly accelerate industry growth. Jordan, if you want to take this one.
I mean, I think something that I think that's going to be critical is really the emergence of this B2B landscape. You know, if you look at the animal protein industry, there's incredible specialization on tasks you didn't even realize happen. The number of companies I've met who are focused purely on how to pump in the right concentration of different, you know, chemicals into chiller baths to make sure that, you know, yield and is achieved while you know, bacteria is killed is incredible. And lots of people spend all their time innovating and thinking about that. You know, when we look at the plant-based side, when, you know, I think some major milestones, whether it was the Beyond IPO or the introduction of the Impossible Whopper, started to get phone calls from companies in the food and ag ecosystem to talk about it. And they were really just like, this kind of caught them by surprise, right? And so I think we're really in the early days of people, of kind of mobilizing the full talent and capabilities of, you know, financial capital, intellectual capital, to really focus on these things so that folks like Celeste don't have to do it all, you know, herself, and that they're truly the full scale of innovation across, you know, the entire food value chain is really creating bespoke solutions. And it's not, you know, it's not players having to work with the kind of off the shelf parts and pieces that I think they've been working with today and making amazing progress with. But I do think we're going to see a lot more specialization in the space that is going to kind of get this positive flywheel going of better and cheaper products and drive that scale.
Yes, I certainly remember the Beyond Meat IPO and the Burger King Impossible Whopper as two big flashpoints as in covering this and getting a lot more people interested in this space. Elizabeth, I'm curious what you think, you know, from your perspective as a company making these products, what do you think will be a big catalyst?
Yeah, you know, certainly the category has come a long way. So lots of good work that's been done. I think in order to accelerate it, and a lot of what the discussion has been here today is, you know, continuing to refine the products, right? Improving eating experience, making them more healthful, cleaner labels, some of the things that we hear consumers saying about the category. So continuing to do that work around innovation and product performance. You know, supply chain, Celeste mentioned partnerships and how to really scale these technologies, and that's an important one. And so looking at how we make these supply chains more reliable, additional manufacturing expertise and experience. It's really where Cargill is focusing our efforts, how we can bring the whole organization to bear, how we can help scale these opportunities, whether they be from our kind of upstream ingredients businesses or manufacturing opportunities. Additionally, I think what will really drive the category is like a longer, broader view of where we're headed. Acknowledging these opportunities, but then getting to work on innovations, better collaborations and partnerships. You know, these investments are happening. Lots of dollars are going into the category. Cargill certainly is investing more across the space. We're working now to nearly double our team of internal employees that are focused in this area. And so I think lots of good work. Continuing to partner, I think, is the thing that will be the big catalyst. There are, like Jordan mentioned, there's a lot of complexity in the existing food chain, supply chain, and animal protein business. And so leveraging the experience and expertise that exists today and working together to bring these new technologies to bear, I think will be really the catalyst as we go forward.
Great. And Eugene, anything to chip in on that?
I think that, you know, we've covered quite a bit of ground. The one thing that I'm really excited about is to find the first cultivated meat product in Europe or outside Singapore. We've obviously seen it just in Singapore, and I think even though it's a tiny market compared to plant-based, and Jordan sort of highlighted some of the huge challenges that the cultivated space needs to overcome to really become bigger. I think it would add quite a bit of buzz if cultivated meat products were to be sold in different countries, and so I think that is one of the potential triggers for a further sort of uplifting growth beyond the ones that were already mentioned.
Yeah, I'm curious too. You mentioned before, Eugene, ESG investors. What role do they play in this? And have you seen that they're increasingly concerned about industrial animal agriculture or climate change? And how do you get them to buy into this movement as well?
I mean, it's a massive market, and just to put it into context, total assets associated with investors that care about ESG globally is about $35 trillion. So we're talking about a third of total money that is managed globally by financial institutions in all sorts of financial products has an ESG angle, and it is growing exponentially. Some of the views out there is that over the next 3 to 5 years, pretty much every dollar that is invested has an ESG angle. And that has serious implications for corporates. We all know about oil and gas, we all know about tobacco, we all know about the sort of defense companies as part of sort of exclusion or impacted by exclusion policies typically adopted by ESG investors. The way that we look at food is that a sustainable food system has a positive implication for all of the 17 SDGs, directly or indirectly. And so therefore, as a topic, it is hugely relevant to investors that have an ESG or impact angle. And what these investors are looking for are not so much today's winners or today's losers, but much more the ones that will be winners tomorrow from an ESG perspective. And obviously they want to avoid the ones that might be tomorrow's losers. And you asked Elizabeth earlier the question about whether there is cannibalization going on. And I think what investors are really increasingly focused upon, and given the experience of the oil and gas sector more recently in particular, is the possibility that these large incumbent food and meat manufacturers, and also dairy companies, by the way, whether their core business from a growth perspective is going to grind to a halt because of the growing market for alternatives. And it's therefore not a surprise that these incumbents are increasingly investing money into that space. They realize that they're at risk. They realize that they need to change. And therefore they're investing money. Even the Brazilian meat companies are buying into cultivated meat companies. I mean, we have a Brazilian session later on today, so I'm quite excited about sort of listening into what the story there is. But so it is a massive market. It is one that companies have to be aware of. Their ability to attract capital, if they don't transition, if they don't move with the tide towards a more sustainable food system, will be impaired. And that will have significant implications. And as I said, you only have to look at the oil and gas sector to get a sense of what that might mean. So it is highly relevant. And for companies not to engage with this would, I think, be the wrong conclusion. I think one final thing is what investors will look for in companies is an understanding of their true commitment to this. Is this playing lip service? Is this greenwashing, if you like, dabbling into this market to claim that they're involved in it? Or is this really moving the needle from a strategic perspective? If the answer is it isn't, well, as I said, then that might not necessarily be good for shareholder value creation.
And you mentioned the oil and gas industries. Do you think that animal meat could be the next fossil fuel with divestment on the horizon unless these animal meat protein companies start investing more heavily or paying more attention to this area?
Well, there is one huge difference that Elizabeth can talk about much better than I ever will between food and beverage companies and the oil and gas industry. Anyone that puts petrol in their car probably doesn't care whether the petrol comes from Exxon or Royal Dutch or BP, as long as it's petrol. On food, on the other hand, it's a very different story. The value of food brands is enormous. The fact that Cargill has been around for 150 odd years is not because they're sort of not knowing what they're doing. They have very strong brands, and the same goes for Unilever, and the same goes for Nestle, and for all the other companies. And so that is the big difference. These food and beverage companies have massive brands. That's a huge asset if they really want to change. So I'm not convinced that we're looking at oil and gas 2.0 because of these brands. But equally, it would be foolish for these companies to simply sit back and relax, believing that these brands will buy them out, if you like. But there is a big difference in that sense.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, since we're talking about Cargill as an example, do you want to chime in there and respond to Eugene?
Sure. No, I think Eugene brings up some great points here, and right around, where the industry is headed when you think about the history of Cargill and the competition in the animal agriculture space, and recognizing the importance of alternative protein. I think you see the investments happening. You see these investments happening broadly. They span everything from the ESG commitments and the investments in improved sustainability, additionally in alternative protein. And so I think we are at a critical point in our food system. Demand is increasing, and we need to do more from a sustainability standpoint. And how we'll do that is really, Cargill thrives in these moments where we can bring to bear 155 years of history, but additionally the breadth of our supply chain and the breadth of what we can bring to meet the needs of consumers. And so I think the fact that we're having this discussion is a great one. These panels and where this industry and category has come is hugely exciting for me personally, and I think for Cargill. And as we think about how we'll solve kind of this future need and nourishing the world well into the future, these conversations are critically important. And so, Cargill's been here for a long time and intends to be here for another 150 years, and doing that by servicing our consumers and our customers. The industry has certainly had quite a lot of headlines around this polarization of what's bad and what's good, and where we all need to get to, in my opinion, is how we solve this together. This can't all be solved in alternative protein. I think some of the assertion that it will be the end of animal agriculture is maybe devoid of consumer behavior. That we, I think there was mention around, is it necessary, or how will we solve for it from an environmental standpoint? And I think we can do both. We can accelerate sustainability efforts in animal protein, and we also can scale alternative protein. And so I think the more that we can come together as a category and as a business and looking at this holistically to solve the needs of customers and consumers, the further we'll be and the more we'll accomplish.
Yeah, Celeste, so Elizabeth says that, shifting entirely to alternative protein is devoid of what consumers are doing. Do you agree with that necessarily? And how do you think that you can get consumers to shift toward, that way of consuming just alternative proteins?
So I'm going to start with what I really see as kind of what our planet needs. Right now, over 50% of land on the planet is used to create animals for feed. That is land that should be taken up by rainforest, grasslands, that has carbon sequestration and all of the biodiversity that keeps us having a wonderful planet. And so that needs to shift, and that needs to shift fast. It's also, animal agriculture is kind of equal to transportation and carbon emissions, and one of the largest use of fresh water and pollutants of fresh water. So a dramatic change needs to happen. It needs to happen fast so that we can keep breathing the fresh air and enjoying this earth. So that's where I really start with thinking about it. The process to get there, we love the fact that Cargill and kind of all these companies want to get into our alternative proteins, because that's the solution. How do we get people on board to make those changes? But if we kind of stay too attached to the history of what we've done in the past, we're not going to probably reach the mission that we need to for our planet. An example that Pat Brown likes to use, and I think a good one here, is we used to have all of our transportation. We walked, then we had the innovation of horses or animals to make transportation, and then there was the innovation of a car. Very quickly, and when there was just horses, there was all this poop and a lot of different disasters within the cities. Once there was the breakthroughs that really said a car does the job of transportation better, we didn't really look back. Does that mean there's no horses? No, there's still some horses around, but how many of us go to your parents' house or go to work or the grocery store with a horse? Very few of us. We've made that transition because the technology has driven what consumers want. The same thing needs to happen with plant-based meat, dairy, seafood, having that protein base below that. So really, to me, it's technology that drives this, and make sure that we listen to consumers on what they need. Consumers make their choices, number one, on does this taste good? Is this delicious? For them and their families and who they want to feed. That is really, really essential, because we love food and we love how it tastes, and we love sharing food with our friends and family. So that is essential to meet those needs. Cost, nutrition, affordability, just kind of availability, not just here in the US, but across the globe and all the different markets, is essential to make those changes. So I'm not saying it is easy, and there's a lot to get there. And I want everybody to be on board, and all the companies that are working in the meat space now, how do they open their eyes to make the transition to join the effort versus being left in a historical technology that is destroying our planet?
Amelia, if I can add, sorry to jump in, if I can add just one thing which might be of interest to the listeners. The World Benchmarking Alliance a day or two ago launched their benchmarking of the food and agricultural space, basically looking at 350 of the largest food and beverage companies globally, including agricultural companies, and looking at them quite detailed in terms of nutrition, governance, social inclusion, some of the factors that matter in terms of certainly investors. And if you look at the average company and how it scores, it actually underlines a lot of what Celeste was saying. If you look at the improvement that is possible for these companies, it's quite enormous, because of the 350, to give you a sense, only 11 score above average. And so that basically means that the vast majority of food, beverage, and agricultural companies across the pillars of nutrition, social inclusion, governance, and the environment score quite poorly. And so for them to make a transition, including, for example, a more sustainable business, would certainly help. And given some of the results that we've seen more recently, there's plenty of upside for that.
Yeah, thank you for hopping in, Eugene. That was really interesting. I'm curious, we've got just another minute or so before we have to end the session, but does anybody want to jump in and say what they think the key challenges are to achieving this vision of alternative protein becoming much more mainstream, much more a share of the overall protein market?
I think I'll just echo what a lot of people have said here. I think it is the continued innovation of the category. I think several have mentioned it, and a lot of work being done to continue to improve and refine products and better meet consumer needs. I think the category has done well. The growth numbers are certainly there. And I think it's for all of us here to continue to make that leap into what these products can do and how they can be the best tasting and most, I think, sought after products for consumers. I think at the end of the day, we've all said it in more than one way, but the consumer will dictate the success of this category, and it's up to us to make these products perform really, really well. So that would be, I think the challenge is just in eatability, and I think we're well on our way to solving that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a great answer to help wrap up the session. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much to our panelists for participating, and thank you to the audience for listening, hopping in, and thank you so much for your comments. Really interesting discussion, guys.